"Hand me your house keys." My daughter-in-law didn't raise her voice when she said it. She didn't need to. She simply held out her hand across my dining room table, as though she were asking for something that already belonged to her. My son, Daniel, stood beside her, with his arms folded, and gave me a slow nod that hurt far more than her words ever could. For one long moment, the only sound in the room was the old grandfather clock in the hallway marking another second of a life I suddenly barely recognized. I reached into my purse, but instead of taking out my keys, I placed one sealed envelope on the polished oak table between us. Ashley smiled. Daniel let out a quiet breath, almost relieved. They thought I had finally given up. They had no idea that everything they believed about this house was about to be tested. Before I tell you how that envelope ended up on my table that afternoon, I'd like to ask you something. If this story truly resonates with you, let me know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Reading your messages reminds me that even strangers can sometimes listen more carefully than family. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 71 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed that love could survive almost anything if you stayed patient long enough. I was wrong. Looking back now, I realize that wasn't simply the day someone asked for my house keys. It was the day I finally understood that a family can slowly stop seeing you long before they stop living under your roof. My husband, Thomas, and I bought our home in Carmel by the Sea more than 30 years ago. We painted every wall ourselves. We planted the white roses along the front walkway one spring after a rainy winter, and every June they still bloom exactly where he imagined they would. Even after Thomas passed away 8 years ago, I never considered selling the house. Every room carried part of our story. Every window reflected a different season of our lives together. Daniel used to understand that. At least I thought he did. When he married Ashley 4 years earlier, I welcomed her with an open heart. I believed that kindness naturally created kindness. She always smiled politely in those first months. She called me Margaret instead of Mom, but I told myself everyone adjusted differently. Little things are easy to excuse when you're hoping for a peaceful family. Then the little things quietly became bigger ones. Ashley started talking about our house instead of your house. She rearranged furniture without asking. She hired landscapers while I was volunteering at the public library. She replaced the brass mailbox Thomas had installed with a modern black one because, as she said, it fits the neighborhood better. Every time I hesitated, Daniel would gently squeeze my shoulder and say, "Mom, she's just trying to help." Those words became so familiar that I almost stopped hearing them. Until the morning, everything changed. Ashley walked into the kitchen, carrying her coffee mug and jingling a small ring of spare keys I had never seen before. She smiled without looking at me. "We're simplifying things around here," she said casually. Daniel looked down at the floor instead of at me. I noticed something else that neither of them realized I had seen. Resting inside Ashley's leather folder was a business card I recognized immediately. It belonged to Richard Bennett, the attorney who had handled every legal document Thomas and I had signed for over 2 decades. Ashley quickly closed the folder before anyone said another word, but it was already too late. In that single quiet moment, I understood that someone had made a move without knowing the entire game, and I suddenly knew exactly who I needed to call the next morning. I did not call Richard Bennett that evening. I sat alone on the back porch instead, wrapped in the old navy blue sweater that had belonged to Thomas, listening to the Pacific waves roll onto the shore below the cliffs. The air carried that familiar scent of salt and damp cedar that had greeted me almost every evening for more than 30 years. Some people believe a house is only wood, stone, and windows. Thomas never believed that, neither did I. A home remembers the people who care for it, he used to tell me whenever we repaired something together instead of hiring someone else. I still hear his voice every time I oil the front door hinges or sweep pine needles off the walkway after a windy afternoon. Those little routines became my way of keeping him close. Before I retired, I spent 38 years teaching American history at the public high school in Monterey. Teenagers changed every few years, but one lesson never did. Respect could never be demanded. It had to be earned and protected. I carried that belief into my marriage, into raising Daniel, and later into welcoming Ashley into our family. Looking back now, I wonder if I confused kindness with surrender. Daniel was a thoughtful little boy. At least he had been. When he scraped his knee riding his bicycle, he always tried not to cry, because he knew seeing him hurt made me cry too. After Thomas passed away, Daniel drove down almost every weekend. He fixed loose cabinet doors, carried heavy grocery bags inside, and insisted on mowing the lawn before heading home. "Dad would want me helping you," he often said with a smile. Those visits slowly became less frequent after he married Ashley. At first I blamed busy schedules. Careers, mortgages, traffic, life. Every mother makes excuses for her children before she admits something has changed. Then Ashley suggested they move into the guest suite temporarily while they searched for a larger home. Only for a few months. She promised one Sunday afternoon, while we shared homemade chicken soup around the kitchen table. "It will help us save for a down payment." I smiled and reached for the bread basket. "This house has plenty of room," I answered. "Family should never struggle alone." Daniel looked at me with grateful eyes. "Thanks, Mom. We will not be here long." I believed every word. The first few months felt almost joyful. We cooked together on weekends. Ashley brought flowers home from the farmer's market. Daniel laughed the way he had when he was younger. Then the rhythm quietly shifted. Ashley began making decisions before asking questions. One afternoon I returned from volunteering at the library and found my favorite reading chair gone. "We moved it upstairs," Ashley said, while scrolling through decorating ideas on her tablet. "The living room feels more modern now." I stood there, holding my canvas book bag. I liked sitting there in the mornings. She barely glanced up. "You will get used to the new layout." Daniel overheard us from the hallway. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Mom, it is only a chair." I nodded because arguing over furniture seemed foolish. But it had never really been about the chair. A few weeks later, I noticed family photographs disappearing from the hallway. Wedding pictures, Daniel's first baseball uniform, Thomas teaching him how to fish. In their place appeared framed abstract prints that matched Ashley's color palette. "The house feels cleaner this way," she explained. I quietly carried one photograph into my bedroom instead of asking where the others had gone. Small changes are easy to dismiss when they happen one at a time. Months later, you wake up realizing your life has been rearranged so gradually that you cannot remember exactly when you stopped feeling at home. That night, as I locked my bedroom door before going to sleep, I noticed something I had never seen before. My old brass spare key was missing from the wooden box inside my closet. I had not touched that box in nearly a year, and suddenly I could no longer convince myself that what was happening was new. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, the way I had for most of my adult life. The house was still quiet, wrapped in that peaceful blue light that comes just before dawn. I brewed a small pot of coffee and carried my favorite ceramic mug onto the back patio. For 20 minutes, everything felt almost normal. The gulls circled above the water, the breeze carried the scent of the ocean through the cypress trees, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe I had imagined the growing distance inside my own family. Then the sliding glass door opened behind me. Ashley stepped outside without saying good morning. She glanced at the mug in my hands before looking toward the flower beds. "The landscaping company will be here at 8, she said. "They are replacing those rose bushes." I looked at her quietly. "Thomas planted those roses." She shrugged as though I had mentioned an old garden hose. "They look dated." We are updating the curb appeal. I rested my cup on the table. Did anyone ask me? Ashley folded her arms. Margaret, we cannot keep making every decision based on memories. Before I could answer, she walked back inside. I sat there for another minute, staring at the white blossoms moving gently in the wind. It was remarkable how someone could erase pieces of another person's life while calling it improvement. Later that afternoon, I drove to the grocery store in Pacific Grove. I bought fresh vegetables, chicken breasts, and Daniel's favorite peach pie because I still believed family dinners could fix conversations that everyday life seemed to break apart. When I returned home, I found 3 unfamiliar cars parked in the driveway. Laughter drifted through the open windows. Ashley had invited friends over for lunch. No one had mentioned it to me. I carried my grocery bags inside and smiled politely. Hello, everyone. Ashley barely looked up from the kitchen island. We already ordered catering, she said. You can just leave your groceries in the pantry. One of her guests smiled kindly and asked, Is this your mother? Ashley laughed softly before answering. My husband's mother lives with us. The words landed more heavily than she probably realized. Lives with us. Not this is her home, not this is Margaret, just someone who happened to occupy a room. I carried the groceries away before anyone noticed the expression on my face. That evening, Daniel knocked gently on my bedroom door. Mom? I invited him in. He leaned against the doorframe, rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when something made him uncomfortable. Ashley is trying really hard to make the house feel like home. I smiled faintly. Daniel, this has always been a home, he sighed. You know what I mean. I wanted to ask him if he remembered building birdhouses with his father in the garage or decorating this very hallway every Christmas since he was 5 years old. Instead, I simply asked, Do you still? He frowned. Do I still what? Feel at home here? He looked away before answering. Things change. After he left, I opened the hallway closet to grab an extra blanket. My winter coats had been moved to the very top shelf. In their place were several neatly labeled storage bins with Ashley's handwriting across every lid. Kitchen decor, holiday entertaining, guest supplies. My belongings had not disappeared. They had simply been pushed farther away, one shelf at a time. Over the next few weeks, similar moments became almost routine. Delivery drivers asked Ashley where furniture should go. Contractors spoke only to her during repair estimates. Mail addressed to me was left unopened on a side table, while packages for Ashley filled the front entryway. Every change seemed small enough to ignore by itself. Together, they formed something much larger. One Saturday morning, I reached for the small ceramic bowl that had always held the spare house keys near the laundry room. The bowl was gone. In its place sat a handwritten note in Ashley's neat script. Please ask me if you need an extra key. We are keeping them organized now. I read the note twice. Then I quietly folded it and slipped it into my sweater pocket. For the first time, I was no longer wondering whether boundaries had been crossed. I was beginning to understand that someone was preparing to decide which doors I would still be allowed to open. The following Tuesday began with an unusual silence. Ashley was rarely quiet in the mornings. Normally, I would hear cabinet doors closing, phone calls about deliveries, or the steady tapping of her shoes across the hardwood floor before I finished my first cup of coffee. That morning, the house felt strangely still. It was the kind of silence that makes you pay closer attention without knowing why. Around 10 o'clock, a large white sport utility vehicle pulled into the driveway. Then another one followed. I watched from the kitchen window as 2 men unloaded boxes, folding tables, and several rolls of architectural drawings. Ashley stepped outside holding a clipboard, greeting everyone with the confidence of someone preparing for a major event. I walked onto the front porch. Are we expecting company? I asked. Ashley smiled politely, but it was the sort of smile that never reached her eyes. Just a few people to help us plan the renovation. Renovation? She nodded as if I had already agreed weeks ago. We are finally turning this place into the home Daniel and I have always wanted. Daniel came outside carrying bottled water for the workers. When he saw me, he hesitated for only a moment before saying, "Mom, we were going to tell you tonight." I looked from him to the stacks of blueprints resting on the hood of one of the trucks. "Tell me what?" Ashley answered before he could speak. "The downstairs will become our primary living space. The master bedroom is much too large for one person anyway." I stood quietly, letting the words settle instead of reacting to them. "That bedroom has been mine for more than 30 years. Ashley tilted her head slightly. "Exactly. It is time for something new." One of the contractors approached, holding a measuring tape. "Where would you like us to begin, Mrs. Collins?" Before I could answer, Ashley stepped forward with the master suite. "We need new flooring, larger closets, and we are opening the wall toward the garden." The man made a note without looking at me again. My opinion had disappeared from the conversation before I even realized it had been excluded. Throughout the afternoon, strangers walked through every room carrying measuring tools, cameras, and notebooks. They opened closets, photographed windows, discussed paint samples, and spoke openly about removing built-in bookshelves Thomas had built with his own hands. I quietly followed them from room to room, not to interfere, but simply to witness what was happening inside the home I still cared for every single day. At one point, I ran my fingers across the edge of the old bookshelf, while two designers debated replacing it with floating shelves. One of them smiled kindly. "It is beautiful craftsmanship," Ashley answered before I could. "Sentimental, but outdated." Later that evening, after everyone had left, I found Daniel sitting alone on the back deck watching the sun disappear into the Pacific. I carried 2 mugs of tea outside and handed him one. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, "Did you know all of this before today?" He stared into his cup. "Ashley has been planning it for months, and you never thought to ask me." He sighed heavily. "Mom, we are trying to build a future." I nodded slowly. "A future should never require erasing someone else's past." He looked at me with tired eyes but said nothing. The silence between us lasted longer than the conversation itself. The next morning, I walked downstairs and found a typed document lying neatly on the dining room table. My name was printed across the top. Beside it rested an empty velvet key holder. Before I could finish reading the first paragraph, Ashley walked into the room, placed both hands on the back of a chair, and spoke with complete certainty. "We need to settle this today. There cannot be 2 people making decisions for one house anymore." Then she slid the document a few inches closer to me, and I saw a signature line waiting at the bottom. My eyes rested on the signature line for several long seconds before I looked up. The paper itself was only 3 pages, neatly printed and carefully organized, but something about the way Ashley stood across the table made it feel much heavier. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Ashley folded her hands together as though she were presenting a perfectly reasonable solution. "It is a household management agreement. It will make daily life easier for everyone." Daniel remained near the kitchen counter, staring into his coffee mug instead of at me. I turned the first page slowly. There were sections about renovations, household expenses, guest approvals, maintenance decisions, and access to the property. One sentence stopped me cold. "All primary household decisions shall be made by Daniel and Ashley Collins." I looked at my son. "Did you read this?" He nodded without lifting his eyes. "We talked about it." "You talked about it," I replied softly. "Did you think about what it means?" Before he could answer, Ashley stepped closer. "Margaret, nobody is taking anything away from you. We are simply organizing responsibilities." You deserve less stress at your age. I almost smiled. It was remarkable how often people wrapped control inside the language of kindness. I closed the document and slid it gently back across the table. I will need time. Ashley's pleasant expression disappeared for only a second. There really is not much to think about. There always is, I answered. The room fell silent. That afternoon I drove to the small bookstore in Monterey, where I often spent an hour browsing before returning home. It had become one of my quiet routines after retirement. When I came back, I noticed something unusual before I even reached the front door. My car no longer responded to the garage remote. I pressed the button twice. Nothing happened. I parked in the driveway instead and carried my shopping bag toward the entrance. Ashley opened the door before I reached it. "Oh," she said casually. "We changed the garage system this morning. The old codes were becoming unreliable. No one mentioned that." She smiled politely. I forgot. I looked beyond her shoulder. The control panel beside the door had also been replaced. Every small inconvenience carried the same message. Someone else now expected to decide how I entered my own home. A few evenings later, Daniel invited several friends from work over for dinner. I spent the afternoon making homemade lasagna because cooking had always been my way of showing affection. As the guests gathered around the dining table, one of Daniel's co-workers admired the house. "You two found an incredible place," he said. Ashley accepted the compliment immediately. "We have been putting a lot of work into making it ours." Her words hung in the air. Daniel smiled politely but said nothing. I quietly passed the salad bowl to the guest sitting beside me. No one corrected the sentence. No one acknowledged the years Thomas and I had spent building this home together. It was not anger I felt in that moment. It was something quieter. The realization that silence can sometimes rewrite history faster than lies. After everyone left, I washed the dishes while Ashley stacked decorative serving trays into the cabinets. "By the way," she said without looking at me, "my parents are visiting next month. They will probably stay for a while." I continued rinsing a dinner plate beneath the warm water. "How long is a while?" "We have not decided yet. Did anyone ask me?" She laughed softly, almost as if I had made a harmless joke. "Margaret, you worry too much. We all live here now." Later that night, I walked upstairs carrying a basket of folded laundry. When I reached my bedroom door, I stopped. A yellow measuring tape stretched across the hallway floor, and small blue painter's tape marked several places on the walls outside my room. Handwritten notes were attached beside each mark. "Remove wall, expand entry, future primary suite." I stood there alone under the hallway light, holding freshly folded towels against my chest, slowly realizing that they were no longer planning changes around me. They were planning as though my room had already become someone else's. I did not sleep much that night. The house creaked the way old houses always do when the temperature drops after sunset. But every familiar sound seemed different now. The hallway that had once carried Daniel's footsteps when he was a little boy running toward his bedroom now echoed with voices discussing floor plans and measurements. Around 2 in the morning, I walked quietly downstairs and stood in the living room. The moonlight spilled through the windows Thomas had insisted on installing larger than the architect originally recommended. "You should always be able to see the ocean from inside your own home," he had said with a grin. I rested my hand on the windowsill he had sanded himself decades ago. For the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to ask a painful question. Had I spent so many years protecting my family that I had forgotten to protect myself? The following afternoon, Ashley's parents arrived from Sacramento. Susan and Michael Parker carried suitcases through the front door as though they had visited dozens of times before. Ashley greeted them with warm hugs. "Welcome home," she said happily. Those 2 words settled heavily inside me. Home. Susan smiled politely when she saw me standing near the staircase. "Margaret, Ashley told us you were excited about all the changes. I looked at Ashley. She calmly adjusted a vase of flowers on the entry table. Did she? I asked. Susan laughed lightly. She said everyone agreed this place needed fresh energy. I simply nodded. Correcting people who had been given only one version of the story suddenly felt exhausting. During dinner that evening, the conversation revolved around renovation schedules, furniture deliveries, and guest rooms. I noticed that every future plan included everyone at the table except me. The upstairs suite will be perfect once the walls come down, Michael Parker remarked. Ashley smiled. Exactly. We have already started mapping everything out. Daniel quietly added, It is going to take a few months. Susan turned toward me. Where are you planning to stay while the work is being done? My fork stopped halfway to my plate. Before I could answer, Ashley spoke as though she had been waiting for the question. Margaret has been thinking about finding a smaller place closer to town. It will be much easier for her. I slowly placed my fork back onto the plate. That is interesting, I said calmly. I do not remember having that conversation. The room became silent for a brief moment. Ashley forced a small smile. We have talked about simplifying your life several times. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent again. His silence had become more painful than any argument ever could have been. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the back deck. The air was cool, and the sound of the waves carried across the darkness. Helen Brooks was watering the flowers in her yard next door. She looked over the fence and smiled gently. Everything all right? She asked. I returned the smile, because old friends often recognize sadness before words appear. I am still standing, I answered. She studied my face for a moment before saying quietly, Thomas always admired how patient you were, but patience should never require disappearing. Her words stayed with me long after she returned inside. Late that evening, I walked into my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were old photographs, handwritten Christmas cards, Thomas's favorite fishing hat, and beneath them, a small leather folder wrapped inside a faded linen cloth. I had not touched it in years. I lifted it carefully into my lap, running my fingers across the worn edges without opening it. Some promises are made for ordinary days. Others are meant for the moment when everything changes. I sat there for a long time before quietly returning the folder to my purse instead of the cedar chest. Then, without saying a word to anyone in the house, I picked up my phone, found one familiar number that I had not called in years, and rested my thumb above the screen before finally pressing the button. I held the phone to my ear while listening to the slow, steady ringing. For a brief moment, I wondered whether Richard Bennett had retired or changed his number after all these years. Then I heard his familiar voice, Richard Bennett speaking. I smiled despite everything that had happened. Richard, this is Margaret Collins. There was a short pause before warmth returned to his voice. Margaret, it has been too long. How are you? I looked around my bedroom before answering. I have reached the point where I finally need your advice. He did not ask questions over the telephone. That was one of the things Thomas had always respected about him. Can you come by my office tomorrow morning? He asked. 9 o'clock? I will be there. When I ended the call, I slipped the phone into my purse and sat quietly for another minute. For the first time in months, I did not feel trapped. I did not feel victorious either. I simply felt clear. The next morning, I left the house before anyone else came downstairs. Carmel was wrapped in a light coastal fog, and the streets were nearly empty except for a few people walking their dogs along Ocean Avenue. Richard's office occupied the second floor of a brick building that overlooked a small public garden. Nothing inside had changed. The same oak bookshelves lined the walls. The same brass clock rested above the fireplace. Richard stood as I entered and shook my hand with both of his. Thomas always said you only visited me when something truly mattered, he said gently. I smiled. He knew me well. We spoke for nearly an hour. I told him everything, not with anger, but with the careful honesty of someone finally putting scattered pieces back into place. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes with a fountain pen I remembered seeing years before. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Margaret," he said quietly, "before I answer any questions, let me ask you one." I nodded. "Have you signed anything?" "No." "Have you voluntarily transferred anything?" "No." He closed his notebook. "Good." He did not explain further, and surprisingly, I did not press him. Some answers carry more weight when they arrive at the proper time. Before I left, Richard opened a locked cabinet and removed a large cream-colored envelope. He placed it on his desk without sliding it toward me. "Do you remember what Thomas asked us to do all those years ago?" I looked at the envelope, but did not touch it. "I remember every word." Richard gave a small nod. "Then you also remember why patience was part of the plan." I did, more than I had realized. As I stood to leave, he handed me a smaller sealed envelope instead. "Keep this with you," he said. "Do not open it unless I am present." I accepted it carefully and placed it inside my purse beside the worn leather folder. "Will I need it soon?" I asked. Richard looked toward the window for a moment before answering. "That depends on choices other people have not made yet." When I returned home that afternoon, no one asked where I had been. Ashley was busy reviewing kitchen samples with a designer. Daniel was taking measurements in the backyard. I quietly carried a basket of laundry upstairs, as though it had been an ordinary day. Ordinary appearances, I had learned, often hide extraordinary turning points. Over the next several days, I changed nothing about my routine. I watered the roses that remained. I baked blueberry muffins on Saturday morning. I attended my volunteer shift at the library. Helen waved each afternoon from her garden, and once she simply asked, "Feeling better?" I answered truthfully, "I finally know what I need to do." She smiled, but did not ask another question. Good friends understand that silence sometimes protects hope. 3 mornings later, I walked into the dining room and stopped. Resting neatly in the center of the table was a polished wooden tray. On top of it sat a blank keyring with a handwritten note in Ashley's careful script. "Please, place all house keys here before dinner. Thank you." I read the note once, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my purse beside Richard's sealed envelope. At that exact moment, I heard Ashley's voice drifting in from the hallway. "Everything will finally be settled tonight." She sounded completely certain. I almost felt sorry that certainty can sometimes be the last thing people lose before discovering how little they truly understand. That evening arrived with the kind of stillness that often settles over the coast before a storm, even when the forecast promises clear skies. The dining room had been arranged with unusual care. Ashley had placed fresh eucalyptus branches in a glass vase, polished the table until it reflected the light from the chandelier, and positioned the empty wooden key tray precisely in the center. Everything looked less like a family dinner and more like a meeting where only one outcome had already been accepted. I carried a bowl of roasted vegetables from the kitchen and set it beside the bread basket without saying a word. Daniel pulled out a chair for me, but his smile never reached his eyes. Across the table, Susan and Michael Parker spoke excitedly about paint colors and contractors, discussing schedules that stretched months into the future. Listening to them felt like hearing strangers plan a vacation inside someone else's memories. Halfway through dinner, Ashley folded her napkin and looked directly at me. "I think tonight is the right time to finish what we started." I reached for my glass of water before answering. "Finish what?" She glanced toward the wooden tray. "The keys, the agreement, all of it. We cannot keep delaying decisions." Daniel quietly cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe if everyone understands the plan, things will be easier." I looked at him for a long moment. Easier for whom? He lowered his eyes again. No one answered. The silence lingered until Michael Parker finally said, "Sometimes families have to make practical choices." I nodded politely. Practical choices should never require pretending someone no longer belongs. No one argued with that. They simply exchanged brief looks, as though waiting for me to become emotional. Instead, I continued eating my dinner. Calmness has a way of making impatient people even more uncomfortable. The following morning, I drove back into Monterey without mentioning where I was going. Richard had asked me to stop by for only a few minutes. When I entered his office, another woman was already there, organizing several folders inside a leather briefcase. Richard introduced her simply. "Margaret, this is Carol Whitman. She has worked as a notary public in Monterey County for over 20 years. Carol smiled warmly and shook my hand. "It is nice to meet you." Richard placed 3 sealed folders on his desk. One remained with him. One he handed to Carol. The third he carefully slid toward me. "Do not open this," he said quietly. "Keep it exactly as it is." I turned the envelope over in my hands. My name appeared neatly across the front in Thomas's handwriting. Seeing those familiar letters after so many years made my chest tighten. Richard noticed the expression on my face, but waited before speaking again. "Everything inside has been exactly where your husband intended it to remain." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Thomas had always believed that preparation was not a sign of distrust. It was an act of responsibility toward the people you loved. Richard then handed me a small card with a date and time written neatly across it. Friday, 10 o'clock. "Please, make sure everyone who believes they should be involved is present," he said. "No surprises?" I asked softly. A faint smile crossed his face. The truth is never a surprise. It simply arrives when people are finally ready to hear it. As I prepared to leave, Carol placed the leather briefcase beside the door. I noticed several official seals tucked inside transparent document sleeves, along with a thick binder fastened by 2 brass clips. I did not ask what they contained. Some questions are answered more honestly by patience than curiosity. When I returned home, I found Ashley standing in the foyer with her arms folded. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Running errands." She studied my face carefully, almost as though searching for something she could not identify. Then she smiled. "Good. Friday morning works perfectly. I already invited my parents because they should witness the transfer." I held her gaze without changing my expression. "I agree," I said quietly. "It is important to have witnesses." Ashley's confidence grew instantly. "Then we finally understand each other." I slipped my purse onto my shoulder and walked upstairs without another word. Once inside my bedroom, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and placed Richard's sealed envelope beside the worn leather folder Thomas had left behind years earlier. They rested side by side in perfect silence. Downstairs, I could hear Ashley laughing as she told Daniel, "By this time, on Friday, everything will finally belong where it should." I gently closed the drawer, knowing that when it opened again, the person who believed she already knew the ending would discover that the story had never unfolded the way she imagined. Friday arrived, wrapped in a cool layer of coastal fog that slowly drifted inland before the sun began to break through. The house felt unusually formal. Ashley had chosen a cream-colored blazer instead of her usual sweater, and Daniel wore the same navy jacket he reserved for business meetings. Susan and Michael Parker were already seated in the living room when I came downstairs. Their coffee cups rested untouched on matching coasters, and quiet conversation stopped the moment they saw me. Ashley smiled with unmistakable confidence. "Good morning," she said. "Everyone is almost here." I returned the greeting with a calm nod before pouring myself a cup of coffee. My hands were steady. That surprised even me. A few minutes later, the front doorbell rang. Daniel opened it. Richard Bennett stepped inside, carrying his familiar leather briefcase, followed by Carol Whitman with a portfolio tucked neatly beneath her arm. Richard smiled warmly when he saw me. "Good morning, Margaret." "Thank you for coming," I answered. Ashley immediately stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett, we appreciate you helping us make everything official." Richard looked at her politely but offered no comment. Instead, he removed his coat and accepted the chair nearest the dining table. Carol quietly organized several documents while placing a notary stamp beside her notebook. The room suddenly felt less like a family gathering and more like a place where facts mattered more than opinions. Ashley slid the household agreement across the table toward Richard. "This is the document we discussed," she explained. "We simply need Margaret to sign so future decisions are clear." Richard adjusted his glasses and slowly read each page without speaking. Every few moments he turned another page with deliberate care. No one interrupted him. Finally, he placed the agreement back onto the table. "Mrs. Collins," he said, looking at Ashley rather than me, "may I ask a few questions before anyone signs anything?" Ashley smiled confidently. "Of course." Richard folded his hands together. "Who prepared this agreement?" "I did," Ashley answered, "with a template recommended by a friend." "And what legal authority does it rely upon?" Ashley hesitated for the first time. "Well, it reflects the understanding within the family." Richard nodded gently. "Understanding is valuable. Legal authority is something different." Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair. Ashley straightened her shoulders. "Daniel and I manage this household now." Richard turned toward Daniel. "Do you currently hold legal ownership of this property?" Daniel opened his mouth but stopped before answering. He looked at Ashley, then at me. Richard did not pressure him, he simply waited. Finally, Daniel admitted quietly, "No." The room became still. Susan looked toward her daughter with a puzzled expression. Michael frowned slightly but remained silent. Richard continued in the same calm voice. "Has Margaret Collins transferred ownership to either of you?" Daniel shook his head. "No," Ashley quickly interrupted. "Not yet. That is why we are organizing everything now." Richard gave a small nod. "I see." He reached into his briefcase and carefully removed a sealed cream-colored envelope. My name appeared across the front in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. The sight of it seemed to draw every eye toward the table. Ashley leaned forward slightly. Daniel stared at the envelope as though trying to remember something long forgotten. Richard rested one hand gently on top of it but made no move to open it. "Before we continue," he said, "there is an important matter that everyone in this room needs to understand." Ashley folded her arms. "Then let us hear it." Richard looked first at me, waiting for the smallest sign. I gave a quiet nod. He turned the envelope over, revealing an intact wax seal that had never been broken. "This document," he said carefully, "was created years before today's disagreement. Everything that follows depends on what is inside." No one spoke. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than before. Richard reached for the edge of the seal, paused for a brief moment, and then looked directly at Daniel. "Before I open this," he said, "there is one question you need to answer honestly, because once the seal is broken, there will be no returning to the version of this family that all of you believed was true." Richard's question lingered in the room like the final note of a church bell. Daniel swallowed hard before answering. "No," he said quietly. "I never became the legal owner of this house." Richard gave a slow nod, not with satisfaction, but with the calm expression of someone confirming a fact that had been carefully preserved for years. He broke the wax seal with deliberate care and unfolded several documents, each protected inside clear sleeves. The only sounds were the turning of paper and the distant cry of gulls outside the open window. "These documents were executed 11 years ago," Richard began. "They were prepared after Thomas Collins survived his first heart attack." Ashley frowned. "What does that have to do with today?" Richard looked at her politely. Everything. He placed the first page on the table. Thomas and Margaret decided that this property would remain solely under Margaret's ownership during her lifetime. The title remained exclusively in her name. That part is straightforward. Ashley crossed her arms. We already knew she owned the house. Richard met her eyes. No, you believed she owned it. You did not know why it had to remain that way. He slid a second document beside the first. This is a legally recorded memorandum prepared the same day. It explains Thomas's instructions if anyone attempted to pressure Margaret into surrendering control of her home through coercion, intimidation, or private agreements lacking legal authority. Daniel stared at the papers without speaking. I could almost see memories returning to him, fragments of conversations he had never paid attention to when his father was still alive. Richard continued. Thomas insisted that Margaret should never be forced to defend herself alone. If such a situation ever occurred, these documents were to remain sealed until they became necessary. Ashley leaned forward. That still does not change anything. We only wanted to manage the house. Richard remained patient. Intentions are evaluated alongside actions. Over the past several weeks, replacement locks, restricted access, unauthorized renovation planning, attempts to obtain exclusive control of household decisions, and written requests requiring Margaret to surrender authority have all created a documented pattern. Carol Whitman quietly opened her portfolio and placed several notarized statements beside Richard's documents. These include dates, photographs, copies of written notices, and records voluntarily preserved by Mrs. Collins, she explained. My eyes briefly met hers. Every small note I had quietly saved, every handwritten instruction Ashley had left behind, every document Richard advised me to keep instead of throwing away, had become part of a story told entirely by facts. Richard carefully lifted another page. There is one more provision. Ashley's confidence had almost disappeared. What provision? Richard answered, without raising his voice. Thomas directed that if Margaret ever faced sustained pressure to surrender possession or decision-making authority inside her own residence, she was to reconsider any future transfer of ownership, regardless of previous family expectations. Daniel finally looked directly at me. Mom, Dad wrote that? I nodded slowly. Your father loved you very much, but he also knew that love should never replace good judgment. Daniel lowered his head, and for the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine shame instead of uncertainty. Richard folded his hands. As of today, there is no legal pathway requiring Margaret Collins to surrender her keys, her room, or her authority over this property. Furthermore, any future transfer remains entirely at her sole discretion. The room fell completely silent. No one argued, because there was nothing left to argue against. The truth had arrived quietly, exactly as Richard had promised. I reached into my purse and removed the small ring of house keys Ashley had expected me to place on the wooden tray days earlier. Instead, I held them gently in my hand before setting them beside my untouched coffee cup. These keys were never the real issue, I said softly. Trust was. No one answered. Ashley looked toward Daniel, expecting him to say something, but he remained motionless. The balance of power had shifted without a raised voice, without anger, and without humiliation. Yet Richard did not close his briefcase. Instead, he reached inside once more and withdrew a final sealed folder that no one in the room had seen before. He rested his hand upon it and quietly said, "There is still one matter remaining, and its consequences will determine what happens after everyone leaves this house today." No one reached for the final folder. Richard allowed the silence to settle naturally before opening it himself. Unlike the earlier documents, this one contained no dramatic surprise, no hidden fortune, and no unexpected inheritance. Instead, it held a series of practical instructions Thomas had written in his own hand years before. Richard read them slowly. If this folder is ever opened, it means my greatest fear has already come true. It means Margaret has been made to feel like a guest in the home we built together. If that day comes, I ask only one thing. Let every decision after this moment be guided by dignity, not anger. His voice grew even softer. Justice that destroys a family is not justice. It is simply another loss. When he finished, the room remained completely still. Ashley stared at the tabletop. For the first time since she had entered my life, she seemed to have nothing prepared to say. Her confidence had not disappeared because someone had humiliated her. It had disappeared because every assumption she had made had quietly fallen apart under the weight of truth. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He covered his face with both hands for several long seconds before finally speaking, "Mom." His voice cracked in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager. I kept telling myself I was trying to build a future. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what it was costing you. I looked at him without anger. You stopped asking because you thought I would always make room for everyone else. He nodded slowly. I did. Ashley finally looked at me. Her eyes were red, though she had not cried. I never wanted to hurt you, she said quietly. I thought I was helping us become a real family, I answered honestly. A real family is not built by deciding who gets pushed into the smallest corner. She lowered her head. Susan reached across the table and gently placed her hand over her daughter's. Ashley, she whispered, there is a difference between taking responsibility and taking control. Michael let out a long breath. We should have asked more questions before assuming everything we heard was true. No one defended what had happened anymore. There was nothing left to defend. Richard carefully gathered the legal papers into neat stacks. From a legal standpoint, he said calmly, nothing further needs to happen today unless Mrs. Collins wishes otherwise. He looked toward me. Every face in the room turned with him. For the first time in weeks, the decision truly belonged to me. I folded my hands together before answering. I am not asking anyone to leave today. Ashley looked up in surprise. Daniel did the same. But some things will change, I continued. The renovation plans stop. The agreements are withdrawn. Every lock, every code, and every key returns to the way they were before. If anyone wishes to remain here, they do so with respect, not authority. Richard gave a quiet nod. That is entirely within your rights. Daniel stood and slowly walked around the table until he reached my chair. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to ask permission before borrowing my toolbox. I do not expect forgiveness today, he said. I only hope I can earn back your trust one day. I reached for his hand. Trust is not rebuilt with promises. It is rebuilt with ordinary choices made every single day. He squeezed my hand gently before stepping back. Ashley remained seated, wiping away a tear she had finally allowed herself to shed. She whispered almost to herself, I spent so much time trying to make this house ours that I forgot it already belonged to someone's life. No one answered, because some realizations deserve silence instead of correction. Outside, the afternoon sunlight finally pushed through the last of the coastal fog, filling the living room with a warm golden light that had been hidden all morning. Richard closed his briefcase. Carol gathered her papers. One by one, everyone stood, not because the meeting had ended, but because the hardest part was finally over. As the front door closed behind our visitors, the house became quiet again, and for the first time in a very long while, that silence no longer felt lonely. It felt like the beginning of something that still needed time, patience, and grace to heal. The weeks that followed did not erase what had happened, but they slowly changed what the future looked like. Healing, I discovered, does not arrive all at once. It comes quietly, almost unnoticed, through ordinary mornings and honest choices repeated over time. The renovation trucks never returned. The rolls of blueprints disappeared. One Saturday, Daniel carried every box of unused flooring samples out to his truck without saying much. Before he closed the tailgate, he walked over to me. "I thought building a better house meant changing the walls," he said. "Now I understand I should have been rebuilding trust instead." I smiled gently. Walls are much easier to repair than trust. That is why we have to protect it before it breaks. A month later, Daniel and Ashley rented a small townhouse about 15 minutes away in Monterey. There was no argument when they packed their belongings, no slammed doors, no accusations. Ashley came into the kitchen on their last morning, holding a small cardboard box. "These belong to you," she said softly. Inside were the framed family photographs she had removed from the hallway months earlier. She looked around the room before meeting my eyes. "I kept thinking I needed to make this place look like my dream home. I never stopped to ask whose memories I was taking down." I carefully lifted one photograph of Thomas, teaching 8-year-old Daniel how to cast a fishing line. "Thank you for bringing them back." She hesitated for a moment. "I cannot change what I did. But I hope one day you will remember that I finally understood it." I nodded. Understanding is where every meaningful change begins. After they left, the house became wonderfully quiet again. Not empty, peaceful. Helen came over that afternoon, carrying a blueberry pie still warm from her oven. We spent nearly an hour hanging the family photographs back where they had always belonged. When we reached the last frame, she stepped back and smiled. "Now it feels like you're home again." I looked around the hallway. It always was. I simply needed to remember that no one can take away your dignity unless you hand it over yourself. Richard stopped by a few days later to return the original documents to my keeping. Before leaving, he placed the sealed envelope Thomas had written years earlier into my hands. "You no longer need me to safeguard this," he said. I looked at the familiar handwriting one final time before placing it inside the cedar chest beside Thomas's fishing hat and the letters we had exchanged during our first years of marriage. Some promises are meant to protect us only until we remember our own strength. As the seasons changed, so did our family. Daniel visited every Sunday afternoon, never arriving without calling first. Sometimes we drank coffee on the back deck and watched the waves roll toward the shore. Sometimes we barely spoke at all. Surprisingly, those quiet afternoons often said more than long conversations ever could. Ashley came less often at first, but when she did, she no longer walked through the house as though she owned it. She knocked before entering, offered to help instead of taking over, and listened more than she spoke. Healing did not erase the past. It simply refused to let the past become the only story we could tell. One crisp autumn morning, I walked into the garden carrying a small shovel and a young white rose bush. The old rose Thomas and I had planted decades ago had finally reached the end of its life after one last beautiful season. I knelt beside the flower bed and carefully placed the new rose into the same patch of earth. As I pressed the soil gently around its roots, the morning sunlight warmed my shoulders, and a cool breeze drifted in from the Pacific. I realized that love and boundaries are not opposites. They grow best together, just like roots and flowers. If you have ever found yourself feeling invisible inside your own family, I hope my story reminds you that kindness should never require surrendering your self-respect. Loving others does not mean abandoning yourself. Healthy boundaries are not walls that keep love out. They are doors that allow love to enter honestly. Your dignity, your voice, and your peace are worth protecting, no matter your age. If this story touched your heart, I would be deeply grateful if you would like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need the reminder that quiet courage is still courage. The greatest victories are rarely the loudest. They are the moments when we choose dignity over bitterness and wisdom over revenge. Thank you for spending this time with me, and allowing me to share a chapter of my life. Wherever you are in the world today, I hope your home is filled with respect, your heart with peace, and your future with hope. Until we meet again in another story, take good care of yourself and of the people who truly value your presence.